Before I begin this last of the presentations, and thank you very much for staying, because I know it's been a very long, intellectually stimulating 3 days, and I want to give you a little bit of background. When I was writing my paper proposal to come to Daneliu this year, I sent it off, and then about 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, I got an email from Dominique who says, I need a clicker. Who says to me, we need to have a Skype call, and we get on the Skype call, and within about 30 seconds, I understand that my submission has been rejected, but I want you to come anyway. And I sort of said, well, you know, Dominique, what would you like me to talk about? And it's like, well, you've been doing all kinds of things in sort of, you know, beyond academia and sort of social activism and that sort of thing. Why don't you talk about that? I'm like, well, lots of questions on what am I exactly doing. So I started doing an introspection of me. And so I mean, this will actually make sense in a second. But the introspection is inspired very much by Dominique and sort of who am I? So I guess I'm an academic because I teach in sociology, and I'm a former chair of the master's program in sociology. I also started something called the President's MBA at the Business School. And I also started something called the Doctoral School, which developed a new model of PhD education, and we wrote a new law on higher education. And that got me into a lot of administrative and teaching skills and teaching things, and I don't do an awful lot of research, which I'm desperately trying to get back into, and doing more writing and publishing. But then during the Maidan, I sort of positioned myself as a kind of a soldier in the information war. And many of you are sort of nodding your heads saying that, yeah, Thoughts from Kyiv was something that we read. Sometimes it was overly alarmist. I apologize for that. But nevertheless, after Maidan, something interesting happened. I became, first of all, advisor to the Minister of Education, then member of something called the National Higher Education Reform Experts Team, and that has to do with PhD reform. I'm very active in something called the Nova Kraina NGO, which I'll talk about a little bit today, and I'm a member of something called the 21 November Initiative. And also, the reason that I was interested in the IDBs is because I'm running a project at the moment for the European Investment Bank. So I guess what I'm doing is I'm kind of straddling academia and social activism. I mean, that's on the slide. I guess that's the reason that Dominique wanted me here. But it goes deeper than that, because back on February 18th, 2014, I wrote a piece which turned out to be one of the most quoted and ended up going sort of around the world many, many times. And it ended with, "My world turned black and white today. There is no gray. Academic impartiality be damned. Evil must be stopped, and God help us." Now, apparently, according to Oleg, that's an argument that comes from a legacy of the Soviet Union. I guess I've become a little bit too assimilated. So I'm not sure that non-rational argument or emotional argument is really something that is a Soviet legacy, but it is something that is definitely a trap that I fell into when I was writing, when I was extensively writing and trying to analyze what was going on around me, and being at the Maidan basically every day and trying to do dispatches from Kyiv on a regular basis. Of course, it was emotional. One of the things I'm trying to do now, in addition to this activism stuff, is trying to actually step back a little bit and gain a little bit of academic distance and try to look at what Maidan was and try to conceptualize Maidan. Now, we started, if I'm not mistaken, we started the seminar with a session on conceptualizing Maidan. So I guess it's kind of appropriate that we'll end it with an attempt at conceptualizing Maidan. And I'm currently in the middle of, I'm trying desperately to finish, amongst the other things that I do, I actually am trying to take some of the texts that I wrote in Thoughts from Kyiv and put them into a book. It turns out that writing Thoughts from Kyiv and writing a book are two different genres, so it's taking quite a little bit longer. But the concept behind the book is that Maidan was basically a three-dimensional revolution, and the three dimensions are basically a reflection of something that Hannah Arendt wrote in her book on revolutions, where revolutions are a moment of completion or adjustment of a historical trajectory, and that I interpret as being the national dimension of Maidan. It's a moment when we have a novelty of philosophical senses, which I'm interpreting as being the postmodern dimension of Maidan. And then we have a transition or inflection point for political development, and I'm calling that the bourgeois dimension. I'm going to focus on the bourgeois dimension more because I think it's something that's really relevant to political elites, and it's something that's really relevant to some concepts that we've talked about already. And I think it's very relevant to social activism. And I think that this is something that I'd want to concentrate more on. But just so that you've got an idea of what I'm talking about with reference to national dimension, so there's this wonderful, wonderful quote: "In searching for Europe, we found Ukraine." And sort of the crucial importance of symbolism, the anthem, the flag, the Cossack Sich, the inclusive patriotism or political nation and rather than ethno-nationalism. I think these are all concepts that need to be further developed. Many of you have developed them during this seminar, and I think and last year's seminars, I understand it, developed many of them as well. I'm also looking a little bit at the postmodern dimension. I've published a little bit on this, and I was lucky enough to have a little article on this published. But I think that there's a lot of things that came out of Maidan which are really interesting, and they are sort of, I'm calling them postmodern because of the fact that modernity is really based on the idea of the sanctity of the individual. And the concept of dignity is very much relational. So it's kind of a collective, if you like, a collective responsibility for individual rights, which I think is an interesting idea, which feeds into something called personalism. The idea of spravedlivist, which is a concept which reflects natural justice rather than formal law, because there's a difference between zakon and pravo, and leaderless agency and depersonalized charisma, which I think is something that we really need to get our heads around, because charisma has always been a tool for leaders. Well, how do you have a charismatic idea where you have a Maidan that rejects leaders? And I think that these are all things that hopefully I'll have an opportunity to talk about at a later stage. I was planning on doing it, but my submission was rejected. So what I'll actually do is talk about a little bit about the bourgeois dimension. And what I'll talk about is Ukraine's new political elite. And just to wake you up a little bit, here's some pictures. Rostislav Pavlenko, who is now the deputy head of the presidential administration, is a former lecturer of political science at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Inna Suvsun is first deputy minister of education. She's a lecturer of cultural studies at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and also the founder of the Tsedos think tank. I'm not sure that you can see them, but Rostik is born in 1976. Inna is born in 1984. Natalia Sevastyanova is born in 1986. She's the first deputy minister of justice, one of the few on these slides that has no connection to Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. But she's a former international law practice and former assistant to Mustafa Jamilov, and also a very well-known lecturer at Odessa Law Academy. Oleksiy Pavlenko, Minister of Agriculture, former CEO of two very different organizations. One is a very large agricultural concern called Rais, and the other one is the equivalent of a Best Buy, if you like, in Ukraine. It's kind of a big box retailer called Foxtrot. He's also a graduate of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. I want to point out a couple things. First of all, I'm pointing out the fact that they're all relatively young. For the position of first deputy minister and minister, those are relatively young ages. Secondly, they're all English speaking. Thirdly, they're all educated in some way in the West. They're all relatively affluent, which in Inna Suvsun, if she heard me say that, would probably say, no, I'm not, but her husband is more affluent than she is, so the family is relatively affluent. They're not the types of people that are looking for they're not living on a pension, and they don't have a problem spending a year, 2 years, 3 years living on 5,000 or 8,000 hryvnia a month, meaning they can take some time off to do some government work. And very much what they're doing is, what they're looking at very often is that their government work is kind of an extension of volunteerism, which I think is an interesting phenomenon. Another one example of that is Oleg Derevyanko, who's a former entrepreneur and investor. He's the deputy minister of education. And now I want to give you two more examples of people that don't have actually formal positions in government. One is Natalia Popovich, born in 1977, founder of the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. She's the president of something called PRP Group, and she's also the vice president of UAPR, which is the PR organization. Clearly, she's a graduate of Kyiv-Mohyla, but nevertheless, she's I mean, clearly from an affluent family. Her husband at the moment is deputy minister of health. This is a family that is extremely active at the moment in politics, and if you look at it, Natalia would never have been active in politics prior to Maidan. But at the same time, Natalia doesn't hold a specific position, and this is something that I think perhaps political scientists, and this is again a postmodern perhaps element. 4 minutes, got it. One more picture then. Valery Pekar, former entrepreneur and investor, founder of something called the Hosh Strategy Group on Maidan, member of the National Reforms Council, organizer of Nova Krajina and co-organizer of the 21st November Initiative. Both of these people they don't hold a particular authority position, but both Valeri and Natalia, and I dare say several others, have the ability to walk into any minister's office and any presidential administration office and any cabinet of ministers' office, and their influence is listened to. And there is a book that describes these types of people. They're called the Flexians, and it's described by a lady by the name of Janine Vaudel, who's written a book called The Shadow Elite, How the World's New Power Brokers Undermine Democracy, Government, and the Free Market. Now, what she's doing is she's clearly looking at this as being a very negative phenomenon, but she's talking about ultra-nimble players moving seamlessly among roles in government, business, think tanks, and the media, and they move back and forth, and what they do is they very much undermine the accepted rules of the game within bureaucracies. Flexians aren't people that are violating the law by stuffing cash into a freezer or promoting their cousins. They're a professional class which obeys a new elite social code that practically requires bending old rules. Now, if you're talking about a North American environment, or if you're talking about a European environment, clearly these people would be considered to be, well, subversive. But if you have a system that needs changing, these are exactly the types of people that you need in positions of power, because the old system needs to be undermined. Interestingly enough, they band together in flexnets, close-knit networks that guard and share information. Just as Flexians cannot be reduced to mere lobbyists, neither can flexnets be reduced to interest groups, lobbies, or old boys networks, mafias, or other such groupings in society. Like interest groups, they serve a long-established function in the modern state, mediating between the official and the private. And like the mafia networks, flexnets have the tentacles in both state and private organizations. Unlike mafia, many of their activities are not secret, but open as members of flexnets make their cases all over the airwaves. Many of these people use media very, very well and are constantly in the media. So I'll finish. Yep. At the center of a flexnet, it's not uncommon to find a university or a think tank, which I guess is not surprising that many of these people are somehow related to Mohila. Finally, FlexNet opinion leaders. I won't have time to go through all of these people, but I think it's a very interesting organization. If you have a chance to look at it, 2111.org, UA. You see a businessman on your right by the name of Evgeny Utkin. You see Vlad Troitsky, who's the organizer of Gogolfest. You see Alexander Starodubtsev, who is now responsible for creating a system of electronic commerce for the government. Interestingly enough, each of these people holds some very specific values and views on economics and politics. Many of them were very much involved in the Automaidan. Automaidan was not a poor man's protest movement. It was about people driving around in Lexuses and Mercedes and Porsches and protesting. And that's not only Lexuses and Mercedes, clearly Fords and Volkswagens as well. But the point is that this was very much a phenomenon that was middle to upper class. If we look at the revolution and the people that came into power, or at least to influence after the Maidan, we see very much sort of an anti-neo-feudal meritocracy being pushed through, rather than a sort of an ascriptive hierarchy kind of value. Very suspicious of the state. Let's put it this way: Anders Åslund in this group of people is taken very well. This is something that's this is a group that interestingly enough, when I'm going, sorry for this short anecdote. Next week, when I go back to Ukraine, I'm actually a moderator at an evening where the vice president of something called the Objectivist Institute, which is the Ayn Rand Institute, is coming to Ukraine. It turns out that there was a letter from the presidential administration because Petro Poroshenko definitely wants to meet with this person because Ayn Rand is one of his heroes. Gives you a good example of what we're talking about in terms of bourgeois values. I'm finishing. Yeah. Last thing, bourgeois dream and flexions that subvert the hydra to the old system and replace an old corrupt networks with new professional ones. I think you can probably read that. So thank you, and I have a feeling I may have sparked a little bit of discussion.
Thank you.